Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak Daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. Robert Hamilton is the president of the Delphi Global Research Center. He served for 30 years in the U.S. Army, retiring as a colonel, and during his career, he was deployed to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Germany, Belarus, Georgia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. He is the author of the book China-Russia Relations, The Dance of the Dragon and the Bear, and holds a PhD in International Relations, as well as an MA in Russian Studies from the University of Virginia. With his experience in the Middle East and his expertise on Russia, Dr. Hamilton is an ideal guest to discuss two ongoing wars, in Ukraine and in Iran. Is this already a global conflict? And why does he say that the US painted itself into a corner in Iran? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Bob, we are witnessing two major wars, in Ukraine and in Iran. There are opinions suggesting that these two wars are in fact connected, as if they form one large, even global conflict. How do you perceive this?
I think they're very much connected. In many ways, Russia and the West are at war with each other. They're just at war with each other through, I wouldn't call them proxies, but in different theaters and through partners, right? So we know almost as soon as the war started in Iran, Russia began sharing intelligence with the Iranians to help them target U.S. forces in the region. We now know that Russia, in sort of an ironic twist, Russia is now sending Shahed or Guran, which is the Russian version of the Shahed, which Iran licensed to Russia to produce on its own. Russia is now sending drones and drone parts back to Iran to help Iran in the war. And Iran obviously has been helping Russia in the war in Ukraine from day one. So they're very much connected. And they're very much, I think, indicators of a long-term, whether you call it a world war, a global conflict, whatever, but a long-term conflict between the West on one side, Europe and North America, and Russia, Iran, North Korea, certainly those three, with China in a smaller but still critical supporting role. And so I've thought about this a lot over the past month or so. I wonder when we started calling it World War. I doubt if we started calling it World War II on the 1st of September, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But that's where most people in Europe now date the start of the Second World War II. So often you don't know you're in a global conflict or a global war until you're able to look back on it and look back on the series of events. And usually then we pick one event and said, well, this is where it really became a global conflict.
But still, this is still not kinetic conflict, between the West and Russia. But with your experience from being deployed in the Middle East, from your experience being somebody who knows a lot about Russia, if we would have to fight two wars, for example, against Russia and on the Middle East, what would it mean for the West?
I think it would mean a couple of things. The war would be defined by a couple of sort of phenomena. One is the West and the U.S. especially, but NATO as an alliance more generally, can bring to bear capabilities against Russia that Russia cannot match. And in a direct war between NATO and Russia, the only way NATO doesn't defeat Russia is if the war ends up in a global nuclear war, right? Because NATO has capabilities, and the U.S. specifically has military capabilities, and we're seeing it in Iran. We saw it on a very small scale in Venezuela, where the U.S. military can do things that no other military in the world can do. And so in a war between the West and Russia, it would look different than what's happening in Ukraine right now. I don't think it would look as different as some people in the U.S. military think it would, because yes, we have capabilities that Russia can't match, but Russia has gained experience over 4 years of war in Ukraine in a type of war that, frankly, the U.S. and NATO have not fought and don't really know how to fight. So it would be a different war. The other phenomenon that we would see, I think, is rapidly depleting stocks of U.S. critical munitions. We're already seeing that in the Middle East. Things like Patriot interceptors, Tomahawk cruise missiles, these things that we call, the U.S. military calls high demand, low density assets. So they're in high demand. but they're very exquisite technology. They're extremely expensive, extremely advanced. They take a long time to produce. So the density of them or the stockage levels of them is fairly low. And so in a war between Russia and the West, the question would be, could the West bring its capabilities to bear to defeat Russia quickly without Russia escalating to nuclear war? And without Russia being able to prolong the war enough that the US or the West starts to run out of critical munitions, critical missiles, and then it becomes a different type of war.
But how much we can be sure, at least these days, that the US would be willing to fight the war against Russia if, for example, Russia would attack Baltic states?
That's the critical question. I'm here in Romania and I'm here for a workshop on Ukraine. And we were with partners from 10 different countries from Ukraine. And then there are 2 of us from the US, and then 8 other NATO countries were here. And frankly, there's been an erosion of confidence on the part of our NATO allies that the US would honor its Article 5 commitments. And that is because of some of the words and the actions coming out of the current US administration, frankly. Donald Trump keeps saying, NATO has done nothing. NATO has done nothing to help us in Iran. Now, we need to put that into context because in the year before the U.S. launched the war on Iran, Donald Trump put tariffs on all of our NATO allies. Donald Trump threatened to invade Greenland multiple times. And by the way, I don't think that discussion is over. He will come back to this at some point. Donald Trump has called Canada the 51st state and has referred to 2 consecutive Canadian prime ministers as governor. Donald Trump criticized and belittled the UK and Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And then suddenly we need NATO's help. And NATO is not all that excited about assisting in a war that it didn't start and it is not part of. And there's been no Article 5 declaration, nor has there been a request from the U.S. for an Article 5 declaration, but NATO would not honor it because the U.S. was not attacked. The U.S. started the war. You can argue that this war was a just war and was started for good reasons. The Iranian regime has killed tens of thousands of its own people. It has a drone program, a ballistic missile program. It supports terrorism. It was enriching uranium. So this is an odious, heinous regime. But nevertheless, I think a lot of the U.S. NATO partners, NATO allies, believe that it was a war of choice, and therefore they're under no obligation to support it. And then the other thing I would say, again, I mentioned I'm here in Romania. So Romania hosts a significant number of U.S. forces at Mikhail Tolganicianu Air Base, MK Air Base. And just last October, without consulting the Romanian government, the U.S. cut its contingent at MK Air Base by about 50%. And now we've asked the Romanians to host 9 tanker refueling aircraft and up to 500 troops. And the Romanians, they're good NATO allies and good partners, have said yes, they've agreed to this. But let's be clear, this shows why allies are important. And this shows that the U.S., yes, it has the most powerful, most capable military in the world, but it still can't do things without the support or at least acquiescence of partners and allies. And this is not a cost-free decision on Romania's part, because Bucharest is 2,400 kilometers from Tehran. And we thought until this war started that the Iranians had capped their missile program at 2,000 kilometers range. Well, it turns out they haven't, because they just fired 2 missiles last week at Diego Garcia, and those missiles looked like they had a range of about 4,000 kilometers. So that puts Romania within range of Iranian missiles. I don't think the Iranians would be insane enough to fire missiles at Romania, but nevertheless, it shows that our NATO partners, even when we treat them poorly, frankly, many of them are willing to take risks on behalf of the alliance and behalf of the U.S., even when it's not an Article 5 situation.
And of course, the United States and Israel decided to strike Iran without informing allies. And in my opinion, also without clearly defining strategic objectives. So as much as US President Donald Trump can complain about NATO and about the lukewarm support for the war by European allies, I don't think this is a surprise. Am I right? This is not me defending the Iranian regime. It's absolutely brutal and horrible.
Yeah, look, Donald Trump is not the first, and unfortunately, I don't think he'll be the last American president who launches a war not clearly understanding the objectives, the political objectives for which he went to war in the first place. The U.S. military can achieve military objectives. It's shown that in Iran. It showed that in Afghanistan. It showed that in Iraq. in the decisive, what we call the decisive phase of the war, in any war plan, you've got essentially four phases, right? You've got a prep phase, you've got a shaping phase, you've got phase three, the decisive operations phase, and then phase four, the post-conflict phase. We win phase three and lose phase four very often. And the reason we lose phase four is where the achievement of military objectives is supposed to translate into the achievement of the political objectives for which you went to war in the first place. And frankly, the political military leadership of the United States has historically been bad at understanding the linkage between achieving military objectives and achieving those political objectives. Part of the fault for that lies with the political leadership for not educating themselves well enough about what the military can really do for them, and also not calibrating their ends or their objectives with the means that they're willing to put into the conflict, and making sure that they're willing to expend enough resources and commit enough means to achieve the ends that they set. And part of it, frankly, part of that, the blame or the fault lies with the military leadership for not insisting on educating their political leaders about what the limitations of military force are. And so that's why you get this, I think, probably deserved critique of the United States that it's operationally brilliant and strategically inept. And I think we're seeing that play out once again in Iran. We've achieved, President Trump's not wrong when he says we've essentially achieved all our military objectives. Okay, great. The Iranian regime is still in power. The Strait of Hormuz is still effectively closed. The IRGC is still now basically running the country, which is in some ways worse because we killed a lot of the political leadership. And now the IRGC, which is the most sort of committed, fanatical, and capable military force, seems to be largely in charge of the country. So I think we've put ourselves in a bit of a cul-de-sac here where President Trump's options are to declare victory and walk away, which he might. He's done that before. He did it in Venezuela, or escalate. And then escalate probably means the introduction of some level of ground forces, probably in a small, localized context. I would be shocked to see 500,000 person invasion force invade Iran, because that would be it would be a mess. But what we may see is this Marine Expeditionary Unit that's en route and the brigade from the 82nd Airborne do some sort of operation to seize some land, maybe part of or all of Harg Island, to try to open the strait. I'm not sure. I don't know. But I think that's where we are. We either declare victory and walk away, or we escalate.
So at this moment, as you mentioned, it seems to me that the United States certainly doesn't have a sufficient number of troops in the region for a large-scale invasion. So something smaller, Hag Island or something like that? You mean something like that?
Yeah, I mean, like a Marine Expeditionary Unit is probably at 5,000 to 8,000, they say around 5,000 people. A brigade, an airborne brigade with all of its, enablers, all of its support is maybe 6,000 to 8,000 people. So you're talking 10,000 to 15,000 people. It's not enough to do anything significant on mainland Iran. It would have to be a very limited ground incursion for very limited and specific objectives. But then the problem is, once you get the ground force ashore on the ground, you've got to protect it and you've got to sustain it.
Yeah, and then I think, what comes to my mind is mission creep, that you will have to do more and more and more. At that one moment, we might end up in the Iraqi scenario or something like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Or, many people are too young to remember, but, one of the classic cases of mission creep was the operation in Somalia in 1992-93 that ended fairly disastrously. It started out as a very limited objective to deliver humanitarian assistance. It grew into a campaign against the Somali warlords who were stealing the assistance and attacking the U.S. force. So this would be much bigger than that, right? Any move on the ground against Iran would be much, much larger than the force that went ashore in Somalia. It would have much broader and more military objectives. That was initially a humanitarian assistance mission, but it ended up a military mission.
In fact, long time ago, I interviewed Mike Durant, who was the pilot of the second Black Hawk Down that was shot down over Mogadishu. So yeah, it's I think this is a very good point, like this comparison to what happened in Somalia. People tend to forget But
They do, yeah.
yeah, apart from a ground invasion, a large-scale invasion, there are also speculation about the possible deployment of special forces that would secure or neutralize Iran's enrichment uranium. Do you think that would be at least be theoretically possible, or is such an operation more in the realm of a Tom Clancy novel?
Well, definitely could be a Tom Clancy novel, yes. All of Iran's uranium enrichment sites would be a pretty significant task. And again, I'm not an expert on Iran's uranium enrichment and its nuclear program, but I know there are more than a few sites, right? There's more than just Natanz. I mean, there are multiple sites. And we also don't know, I don't think we know. Look, we may, though. We have very good intelligence, but our intelligence is far from infallible. We may not know where the highly enriched uranium is. There was evidence that some or all of it was moved out of the nuclear sites before the strikes last June. And so I'm not sure we know where it is. That would be an extremely high risk operation, and it would have to be predicated on really exquisitely accurate intelligence, almost unprecedented accuracy, because again, the universe of sites that you would have to seize and secure, if you didn't know where all the components of the nuclear program actually were, you have to seize and secure all the potential sites. That would be a much larger operation. It would be a very large operation, and it would be a very high risk operation. If your intelligence is, you have high confidence in it and it's extremely specific where you know exactly where you need to land and seize, then you can. Then it's possible, I think. But you're gambling that your intelligence is perfect. And US intelligence is very good, but I've never seen it perfect.
Do you assess the role of Israel in all of this? There is a level of cooperation here, but it seems that Israel also has its own objective, for example, attacking targets in Lebanon. So how do you assess the role in Israel in all of it?
Well, the US and Israel clearly coordinated and planned this operation jointly. But, there's this narrative that Prime Minister Netanyahu is the one who convinced President Trump to undertake the operation. Both Trump and Netanyahu say not true. And Netanyahu even famously said on camera, come on, have you ever seen anyone convince President Trump of anything he doesn't want to be convinced of? And okay, he might not be wrong about that. But I think it's also true that Trump and Netanyahu have a very close relationship, and there's a lot of mutual trust there. And if Netanyahu probably has enough influence that if President Trump were sort of on the fence, Netanyahu could push him one side or the other. So then you get to the question of what are Israel's objectives and what are the U.S. objectives? The longer the war goes on, the more clear it becomes that they're different. And that Israel's objectives, I think, are far more expansive and far more ambitious than the U.S. objectives. Donald Trump said day one of the war, it was about regime change. Now he's backed off that. I'm not sure for the U.S. it ever was about regime change. I think that maybe the set of U.S. objectives revolved around crippling the nuclear program, crippling the drone and ballistic missile program, destroying the Navy, and eroding Iran's ability to support terrorism around the world. And then there was the thinking that, and if the regime falls, that wouldn't be bad either. I think the Israeli objective is for the regime to collapse. I think the Israeli objective is for the Iranian government, the Iranian regime to collapse and be replaced by something else. I don't know inside the Israeli government what they think that would be. The Israelis know Iran, I think, better than the United States does. We have very good intelligence. They probably have better intelligence on Iran. It is their number one existential enemy. It has been since 1979. And so it will be interesting to see if President Trump declares victory and walks away, does Israel keep fighting? And I've had some interesting discussions with some Israeli colleagues and friends and some American Israeli colleagues and friends. And some of them say, well, no, if the U.S. says stop, the Israelis will stop. I'm not so sure that's right. One thing the U.S. does have is if it really wants Israel to stop, it can turn off certain capabilities that Israel has that were provided by the U.S. Now, to do that, there's a high cost in doing that in terms of trust, because if you sell equipment and sell weapons and sell aircraft and missiles and things to a partner, and then you turn them off when they get in a war, you turn off their capabilities, there's a cost to that in terms of, trust in the U.S. as a partner. There's a cost in terms of willingness of our partners to buy U.S. equipment. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I don't claim to know where this is going, honestly.
Yeah, probably no one knows at this moment, probably not even President Trump. But what would be your advice for President Trump? To stop and declare the victory?
What a question. That's a great question. That's a really hard question. I don't know. If I could go back in time, my advice would have been don't launch this war unless you know exactly what end state is acceptable to you. And then use overwhelming military force quickly to get to that military end state and ensure that it achieves the political objectives you want. We didn't do that. And so, again, where we are now, if I were advising the president, let's keep in mind that this administration is uninterested in my advice and I'm uninterested in being part of it, but there's no good answer to that question. What I can do, Andre, I think is sort of list what I think are the pros and cons of the two approaches. Declaring victory and walking away, the pro of that, the advantages to that are you already have destroyed much of Iran's military capability. You can probably then come to some agreement that will effectively reopen the Strait of Hormuz. You can then enter into a negotiation about the nuclear program and other things. Those are the pros. The cons are the Iranians will claim victory and they won't be wrong because they have survived. All they have to do is survive and they win, right? In a sense, they are the insurgents in this war, right? An insurgent doesn't have to defeat the enemy. He just has to not lose. And that's the position they're in. If they survive, they win. So it will damage U.S. credibility, both military and political credibility. Another pro, though, is we're rapidly burning through some of those high demand, low density assets I talked about earlier. And there is a cost to our ability to respond to other theaters like Europe and the Indo-Pacific, that if we stop using those weapons in Iran now or soon, then we can start to rebuild the supplies of them. So we are better postured to support Ukraine, which I think is frankly more important to U.S. national security than what's happening in Iran. We are not supporting Ukraine directly anymore, but we're supporting it through our European partners. And we can then do that and we can be better postured in the Indo-Pacific. So, to me, there are a lot of pros to just declaring victory and stopping right now. The big con is it's a massive hit to U.S. credibility and legitimacy. And President Trump cares very deeply about his personal credibility and legitimacy. And so in terms of escalating, the one big advantage is if you do it well and, you escalate with land forces, because you're not going to win this war through the air alone. Nobody's ever won a war, especially a war where the objective is the complete destruction of the enemy military and political leadership, so regime change. It's never happened. It didn't happen in Kosovo. Milosevic stayed in power for almost a year more after NATO stopped bombing him in 1999. It didn't, people will say, well, Gaddafi in Libya, right? It was no, there were land forces involved. They weren't NATO or US, but there were land forces. There were opposition ground forces. So you're not going to win this war through the air alone. So if you really want to win it, you have to commit ground troops. And so committing ground troops in a very, very narrowly scoped operation that then has strategic effects could get you to a point where the Iranians are willing to make a better deal to get U.S. forces off their soil. But again, you've got to determine exactly where you want the ground forces to be, exactly what you want them to do. Think about how this ground operation will have strategic effects and will put the Iranian government in a dilemma that the only way out of that dilemma is to agree to peace, to agree to a peace that is more to the advantage of the U.S. than what we have now. That's hard to do, frankly. And, I can't make that assessment you would have to have access to the intelligence to know what the mission of a ground force would be. What you'll hear people talk about, again, I said it earlier, seizing all or part of Farg Island to try to open the Strait of Hormuz and hold that at risk, right? Hold Iran's ability to close the strait at risk. But, the Iranians have other ways to affect the strait. They still have drones, they still have missiles, they still have mines, they still have some naval capability, not much, but some. So we painted ourselves into a bit of a corner here, I think. And I don't think there is a good option. So, if I'm advising the person who's making this decision, all I can do is, I think, what I've just done and lay out the pros and cons of each option. But those are the only real options I see. I don't see a way to escalate in a way that really puts the Iranian regime in a dilemma by just continuing to use air power. You have to use ground forces in some way. And then that becomes riskier and messier.
But President Trump also said that he might start to bomb Iran's energy infrastructure, which frankly speaking, I think that would be basically the same what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. That's why I'm saying this is pretty controversial. So that would be a huge escalation, but I don't believe that it will lead to any good outcome.
Yeah, I mean, that's the step that President Trump has repeatedly threatened over the past several days. And now he's put it off for 10 days because he says we're in good, having good discussions with the Iranians. The Iranians keep saying we're not negotiating. So I'm not sure. We are apparently talking to them through an intermediary. And so there are indirect discussions going on. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, Andre. The Russians have been bombing Ukraine for 4 years and indiscriminately. And the U.S. is not going to do to Iran what Russia's doing to Ukraine, which is murder civilians, bomb schools and hospitals and apartment buildings intentionally. There was a school bombed on day one of the war. It does look like the U.S. did it. That was clearly a targeting error. It was a mistake. There's an investigation going on. The results of the investigation, I think, will probably show there was an error. It was a mistake. I hope the U.S. will then apologize for the mistake because, again, yes, the Iranian regime is odious and heinous, but these are school children that were killed and parents. And so historically, when the U.S. has done things like this, has made mistakes like this, it has apologized and admitted the mistake. If it turns out that that's what happened, that's what we need to do. So bombing energy infrastructure, I don't think is going to end the war either. Again, as you said, the Russians have been doing it to Ukraine and Ukraine's been doing it to Russia, with drones, bombing refineries and fuel distribution centers and things like that to try to cripple the Russian military machine. And I think the latest figures I've heard is Ukraine has taken 14% of Russia's refining capacity offline. And at the highest, it was, 20 or 25%, but then they're able to repair things. And the Russians tried all winter to destroy the Ukrainian power grid, and they haven't. I was in Kyiv last week. I got to tell you, the mood there is better than I've seen it. Well, I guess it was my 5th or 6th visit in the last 2 years. The mood there is better than I've seen it on any previous visit because the Ukrainians understand that Russia threw everything it had at them all winter, and they made it through the winter. And now they have the spring, summer, and fall to rebuild their energy grid and to build in resiliency and redundancy, and hopefully they will. And so it's hard to turn out the lights and end the war. Turning out the lights does not generally end the war. And in some ways, you just build determination and resolve in the population. You make people angry. They're angry at the aggressor, right? They're not angry. Ukrainians weren't angry at their own government. There was some frustration with the city administration in Kyiv because they didn't think it was prepared. But most people understand who's actually doing the death and destruction. And it's not the Kyiv city administration, it's the Russian military. And so my concern is if we start bombing energy infrastructure, yes, we will then take the war to the Iranian people and impose a cost on the Iranian people. And yes, the regime has been largely unpopular, but I think we run the risk of increasing support for the regime because the Iranian people are then angry, not at the regime, but at the U.S. for bombing, for turning out the lights, for destroying energy infrastructure, which is the main way Iran makes money, and for potentially turning off power grid, destroy refineries and things like that, meaning fuel wouldn't be available. So yes, it's an escalation. And yes, it hurts the regime more, but it also hurts the Iranian people more directly, which is something we've tried to avoid to this point in the war. We've tried to focus on destroying the top levels of the political leadership and destroying their military capability. President Trump even said on the first night of the war to the Iranian people, don't go out into the streets now, stay home. It's going to be dangerous. At some point, I think he thought by this point, the regime would be so weakened, it would collapse and the Iranian people could come to the streets and, I don't know, in some sort of Jeffersonian dream, write a democratic constitution and, run the country themselves. But that doesn't often happen. I think that was a bit of a fantasy.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.